Well, hey, welcome. I'm Chris, the Pastor Compass. As always, I'm super glad that you're with me. Now, there's a social media phenomenon that you may not have heard about, but you've probably seen. It's called vague booking. Vague booking is the practice of making a post on social media, primarily on Facebook, that is intentionally vague, but highly personal and emotional. So, for example, here's a post where someone said, "If you have a conversation with me and disrespect me, please don't say I love you at the end of the call. That's all." Now, this person is clearly talking about someone specific, but they're being vague about who it is. Although we know that it's her brother because he reposted it saying, "My sister likes to vague book after speaking with me on the phone." Now, vague booking is a way to passively aggressively say something or about somebody publicly. But it doesn't always land the way that you want it to because people don't always know who it's about. I mean, this person posted this. They said, "I've made it 21 years without you. Why do you think I need you now?" To which someone replied, "'Cause I'm your grandma and I need you." This post wasn't about grandma, but she didn't know that. This other person posted, "Get your facts straight before you come to me thinking you know it all." And then they commented this, "This is about you, Kayla, so I don't know why you liked it." Kayla liked that post because she didn't know it was about her. Vague booking can also be unintentionally hilarious. Look at what this person said. They said, "Definition of passive aggressive. Posting messages on Facebook about people you are upset with, but not mentioning them by name. Better solution? Make a call, talk it through, hug it out, move on. Life is too short." And then they say this, "And you know exactly who you both are." I mean, how they missed the irony in this is completely beyond me. Now, Jesus didn't have Facebook, but if he did, he may have been accused of vague booking because he often used subtext to communicate things to people. He used stories to say things about people in subtle ways. And today we're going to look at one of those stories in Matthew 21, verse 33. And it starts by saying this. "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and he built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit." So Jesus is here. He's confronting the priests and religious leaders in the temple at Passover time. And Jesus tells the story of a vineyard. Now, his listeners didn't know this right away, but I'm going to spoil this for you, okay? The landowner, he represents God, and the vineyard represents Israel. Now, we'll get to the tenants and the servants in a second, but before we do, I'd like you to ask yourself a question as we walk through this, and it's this. Who am I in this story? Who do I identify with? Okay, let's continue in verse 35. "The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. So then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. 'They'll respect my son,' he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, 'This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance.' So they took him, they threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" The killings of messengers and the son of a landowner would have been appalling to Jesus' listeners, mostly because it was considered a truly evil and immoral act, but also because the people hearing this, including the religious leaders, they identified with the landowner and his servants. They were the good guys. They were the people who were victims of the true villains, the cruel tenant farmers. Anyone hearing this would have been outraged by the events of this story, including the religious leaders who responded to it in verse 41. They said, "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end," they replied, "and he'll rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time." The religious leaders hear this, and they're like, those vile and evil men, they're going to get what they deserve, and they deserve a brutal death with the same suffering that they inflicted on good and innocent people. And then when that happens, the landowner, he'll put his vineyard in the hands of people who will honor and respect him, people who are worthy of it. His response, it actually makes perfect sense within the logic of this story. But the priests knew that when Jesus told a parable, there was always a story within the story. And while their response makes sense in the literal world of the story, it also makes sense when you consider what they probably thought Jesus was really saying. You see, they lived at a time when Israel didn't exist as a nation. Their territory had been taken away from them hundreds of years before and then passed down from one conquering nation to another until finally Rome had it. Rome now occupied the land that had been stolen from its rightful owners. And the Jewish people, they held out this hope that a time was going to come when they would take their nation back and restore the kingdom of Israel. So in the story within the story, the priests, they saw the landowner as God, they saw the vineyard as Israel, but they saw the evil tenant farmers as Rome. They saw themselves as the servant who God sent to restore what was rightfully his. And to the question, what should God do to Rome and its people when he takes back this land? Their answer was obvious. Crush them, destroy them, kill them all. Pay them back 10 times over for all the suffering that they inflicted on us. How they reacted to the story was based on how they saw themselves within the story, as victims of Rome. Jesus even said something that probably made them feel like they were right about this interpretation. Look what Jesus said as he continued in verse 22. Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes." So here Jesus quotes part of a psalm that may seem a little out of place to us, but that made perfect sense to the priests who knew it in its context. And let's look at the context in Psalm 118:11. It says, "All the nations surrounded me, but in the name of the Lord, I cut them down. They surrounded me on every side, but in the name of the Lord, I cut them down. They swarmed around me like bees, but they were consumed as quickly as burning thorns. In the name of the Lord, I cut them down. I thank you for answering my prayer and giving me victory. The stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone." He's saying we were surrounded by foreign nations who ruled over us, who subjugated us and took advantage of us, but God cut them down. He restored us and became the cornerstone of our nation once again. And in Jesus' story and in his quoting of Psalm 118, the priests, they hear a reference to the freedom from oppression and then the punishment of their oppressors. And maybe they think that Jesus isn't as bad as we thought. But Jesus didn't stop there. He had more story to tell in verse 43. "Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." So this is where Jesus stops vague booking. He comes right out and says it. You think the vineyard should be taken away from the people who stole the vineyard and rejected the landowner's messengers, right? You think their corruption should be punished and that they should pay for their oppression, right? Well, guess what? The Romans are not the people who took over the vineyard for their own ends. You are. Rome isn't the oppressor who rejected God. You are. And the stone that you thought was the sign of your glory and power and victory, let me tell you a little more about that stone. And then after he says this, Jesus points to 2 more passages in the Jewish scriptures about the cornerstone of God. Let me show you these. Isaiah chapter 8:13. It says, "Make the Lord of heaven's armies holy in your life. He is the one you should fear. He is the one who should make you tremble. He'll keep you safe. But to Israel and Judah, he will be a stone that makes people stumble, a rock that makes them fall." So in quoting Isaiah, Jesus is saying this. He's saying God may be the cornerstone to the people who honor him, but when his people reject his ways, he's a stone they stumble on. And you guys are tripping all over it. You thought Rome was the oppressor, and you wanted them to fall and stumble on this stone and be crushed to pieces. But you are the oppressors. And then after Jesus referenced Isaiah, Jesus references another stone passage from Daniel. And let me just give you some super quick background on this, okay? Daniel had been called to interpret a weird dream that the king of Babylon had. It's a whole weird story, but look at what Daniel said about this in Daniel 2:34. Said, as you watched, a rock was cut from the mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits, and the whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. And then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on a threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the earth. During the reign of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands. Okay, again, in the king's dream, there was this big rock that smashed into a huge statue that was made of all different kinds of metal. And then that rock became a mountain that covered the whole earth. And then Daniel explained that the different metals represented different kingdoms and empires that oppressed and enslaved people. And he said that the rock that crushes those earthly empires is God's kingdom, a rock that will eventually crush every oppressive earthly system. And Jesus tells the priests and religious leaders, that's you. You think the Romans are the oppressive leaders who will be crushed by the kingdom of God, but you are. You are the ones who've taken control over God's vineyard. You are the ones who've corrupted it, oppressed the people, and rejected God. And you are the ones who will stumble over and be crushed by what God is doing. And then in verse 44, it says that when the chief priests and Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people thought that he was a prophet. So there's a lot of stories here. There's the story of the vineyard. There's the story within the story of the vineyard that the priesthood. There's the story within that story of a cornerstone that's established in a kingdom that's surrounded by enemy nations. And then there's the story within the story of Daniel interpreting a dream, the story of the kingdom of God that's going to come and crush oppression and establish peace. There's so many stories and so many things that we could take away from those stories. But there's one takeaway I want us to see, and it's actually a question I want you to ask. Where do you see yourself in the story? Who do you identify with? This is an important question because it's possible for us to miss out on the big picture story of what God's doing in our world because we identify with the wrong characters. The priests and religious leaders, they saw themselves as the victims, when in actuality, they were the villains. They saw themselves as the oppressed when they were actually the oppressors. Rome may have established an empire of power in the world, but the religious leaders had set up an empire of spiritual oppression, one where they used religion to control people and enrich themselves, one where they used God's name in a way that actually pushed him out of his own vineyard and then kept his people imprisoned in a broken religious system. Who am I in God's story? Who are you? If Kayla can like a vague book post that's actually about her because she thinks it's about somebody else, so can we. And if the priests can see themselves as the victims when they're really the villains, so can we. See, the stories of Jesus are meant to be a mirror for us to hold up, to see ourselves in, and then to understand where we are in relation to his kingdom. They're meant to guide us and change us, revealing the story within the story, and then teaching us to think like Jesus thought. So today I'd like us to see ourselves as the priests in this story, as people who have the potential to completely miss what Jesus is saying and miss what God is doing, as people whose pride can cause us to condemn others for the very same things that we are doing, who make ourselves victims instead of villains. I want us to identify with the priests because I want us to learn a lesson they didn't. I don't want to be surprised one day when I stumble over what God is doing because I'm not aligned with him, or I'm crushed by his kingdom because I've been opposing it even without knowing it. because I didn't understand where I fit in his story. So may we be self-aware followers of Jesus. May we be less religious and more receptive to him. People for whom the kingdom of God is the cornerstone of our lives rather than a stone that crushes us because our lives are lived in opposition to it. And as we begin to see ourselves clearly in the stories of Jesus, may we learn to think like he does about ourselves, about our world, and about his kingdom. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.